All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that's been generating a lot of buzz, USAID spending.
Yeah, and, it's a topic that always seems to spark some pretty strong opinions.
Oh, for sure. And we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive. We've got congressional committee reports, international news coverage, and even an opinion piece that focuses specifically on the debate about religious freedom.
Quite a spread. It really highlights how complex this whole issue is.
Absolutely. So today, our mission is to kind of cut through all the noise, go past the headlines, and try to figure out what's really going on here. Like, what are the actual facts?
Right, exactly. What are the different perspectives and, what does it all mean for USAID's mission and for America's role in the world?
Yeah, totally. So to kind of set the stage here, I think it's important to rewind back to the Trump administration. That's when this whole saga around USAID spending really started heating up.
Yeah, for sure. They put a pause on a lot of foreign assistance and launched a bunch of investigations into whether USAID funds were actually being used effectively and responsibly.
Right, and a lot of those decisions were definitely fueled by some pretty strong opinions about USAID.
Yeah, President Trump was a very vocal critic and even clashed with the agency's leadership over certain policies.
And then you had figures like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who believed that USAID was operating more like a global charity than a strategic tool for advancing American interests.
Right, and he felt that the agency wasn't aligned enough with U.S. foreign policy goals.
So there was definitely this underlying tension, this sense that maybe USAID was a little out of control.
And that brings us to the really controversial part. The specific expenditures that Chairman Mast and the House Foreign Affairs Committee labeled as outrageous.
And that's where things got really interesting.
Definitely. And some of these examples were pretty attention-grabbing, like the $15 million that was allocated for condoms to be distributed in Afghanistan, even under Taliban rule.
Okay, yeah, that one definitely raised some eyebrows. But what was the thinking behind that? It seems pretty jarring at first glance.
Well, the rationale was partly based on public health concerns. There was this ongoing worry about the spread of HIV/AIDS, even in conflict zones, and the goal was to prevent the further spread of the disease.
So the idea was that these issues don't just disappear because there's political upheaval. Makes sense.
Right, but the committee didn't stop there. They went on to highlight a whole range of spending that they saw as questionable, from funding LGBTQ initiatives in various countries to promoting, get this, atheism in Nepal.
And some of those programs definitely sparked debate, like the funding for a pier in Gaza, which had a price tag of $350 million. Critics argued that this kind of infrastructure project could end up benefiting groups like Hamas.
Exactly. And that raised concerns about oversight and accountability. How do we know that the money is being used for its intended purpose?
Right, and there were also those concerns about the funding directed to EcoHealth Alliance, which, as many people know, has been linked to the Wuhan lab.
Yeah, and then there were also allegations that food aid intended for Syria was actually ending up in the hands of al-Qaeda fighters.
And we can't forget the claims that USAID funding was indirectly supporting the Taliban's heroin trade.
Right. Some sources even claim that millions of dollars were being funneled into this.
So as you can see, it's a pretty complicated picture.
Okay.
And it definitely created a perception, at least among some lawmakers, that USAID was maybe a little too loose with its purse strings.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. But before we jump to any conclusions, I think it's really important to remember that there's another side to this story. Not everyone agreed with the Trump administration's approach or with the way USAID spending was being portrayed.
Right, there were a lot of folks who pushed back pretty hard against this whole narrative.
Especially Democrats. They saw these investigations as politically motivated, basically, a way to undermine an agency they generally supported. They even called it a heist because they felt it was an attempt to divert funds away from important programs.
So right off the bat, we've got two very different narratives emerging. And I think it's crucial for us to understand both sides before we can really make sense of this whole debate.
Absolutely. And beyond the political back and forth, there were also some very real concerns about what scaling back USAID could mean on the ground. Democrats argued that it would disrupt critical programs that were providing essential aid, especially in more vulnerable regions.
Right, because it's important to remember that USAID isn't just about promoting American interests. It also plays a huge role in things like disaster relief, global health initiatives, and education programs.
And so, from that perspective, cutting funding could actually do more harm than good, both for the people who rely on that aid and for America's standing in the world.
Right. I mean, it really gets this question of what role America should be playing on the global stage, right? Like, how do we balance our own interests with humanitarian concerns?
Exactly. And that leads us to another layer of this whole issue, one that's really connected to American values: religious freedom.
Yeah, this is where things get particularly interesting. Vice President J.D. Vance, who's a devout Catholic, entered the fray with some very specific concerns about USAID's activities. He felt that the agency was actually promoting atheism abroad, especially in places like Nepal.
Yeah, and he saw this as a direct contradiction of the principles of religious freedom.
So his argument was that instead of promoting freedom of belief, USAID was actually using taxpayer dollars to actively promote a specific non-belief.
Right. And he felt that this was overstepping the agency's mandate and infringing upon the religious liberty of others.
So it raises this really tricky question about the line between promoting religious freedom and imposing a secular worldview.
Right. It's a very difficult balance to strike, and it's one that USAID found itself grappling with.
And this wasn't just a fringe concern either. Other Republican lawmakers, like Representative Chris Smith, also raised red flags about the State Department funding programs that specifically aim to spread atheism.
Yeah, and it really makes you think, right? Like, what is the role of the U.S. government in shaping beliefs and values in other parts of the world?
And this is just one example of how this whole debate about USAID spending goes way beyond simple accounting. We're talking about deeply held values, different cultural perspectives, and really the very role of America in a globalized world. It's really interesting how this concern about promoting atheism ties into those broader questions about what USAID is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and it's not just limited to atheism either. There were concerns about USAID funding LGBTQ initiatives, especially in places where, those identities aren't exactly widely accepted.
Oh yeah, like in some countries they're even criminalized, right?
Exactly, and it's a sensitive issue for sure.
There was that $1 million grant, right? The one to boost French-speaking LGBTQ groups in West and Central Africa.
Right. And that one definitely stirred up some controversy.
It makes you wonder, is the U.S. government kind of overstepping its bounds? Are we trying to impose our values on other cultures?
It's a valid question. And then, on the other hand, you could argue that it's about advocating for basic human rights.
Yeah, that's the tricky part. Where do we draw the line between cultural exchange and cultural imperialism? It's a debate that's been going on forever.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And USA is kind of right in the middle of it all, trying to navigate these really complex cultural and political landscapes.
So where do we even start with trying to reconcile all these different perspectives? It seems like everyone has a different opinion about what USAID should and shouldn't be doing.
Well, I think transparency is a good place to start. USAID needs to be really clear about its goals and how it's using taxpayer money.
Right, so people can actually understand where their money is going and hold the agency accountable.
Exactly. And there also needs to be a strong system of oversight, to make sure that the money is being used effectively and ethically.
Yeah, and that includes taking into account the cultural and political realities of the countries receiving the aid.
Exactly. You can't just throw money at a problem without understanding the local context.
It's kind of like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right. And I think dialogue is also really crucial. USAID needs to be engaging with all sorts of different stakeholders, local communities, religious groups, human rights organizations, you name it.
So they can actually make sure that the programs they're funding are aligned with the needs and values of the people they're supposed to be helping.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot between promoting American values and respecting the sovereignty of other nations.
Yeah, it sounds like a delicate dance.
It is,
Yeah.
but it's a necessary one if USAID wants to be effective and maintain its credibility in the world.
So where does USAID go from here? I mean, after all this scrutiny and debate, what does the future hold for the agency?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, it's hard to say for sure. But, with everything that's happened, the investigations, the criticisms, the agency's kind of at a crossroads.
Yeah, some people are saying it needs a total overhaul.
Right. And then there are others who think that just a few targeted reforms would be enough to get things back on track.
And then you have the folks who think USAID should just be scaled back altogether.
Yeah, there's definitely a range of opinions out there. But one thing's for sure. The scrutiny on USAID spending isn't going away anytime soon.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, as citizens, it's our job to stay informed, to ask tough questions, and to hold our government accountable.
Exactly. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that our foreign aid is actually making a positive difference in the world.
Right, that it's being used effectively and ethically to improve people's lives and create a more just world.
Well said.
So before we wrap up, I think it's worth mentioning one more piece of this puzzle. It's not directly related to USAID spending, but it adds another layer of complexity to this whole conversation about American influence abroad.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Remember that grant for the transgender-themed opera in Colombia?
Oh yeah, that one caused quite a stir.
Well, it turns out that wasn't an isolated incident. There's actually a growing trend of USAID and the State Department funding similar projects around the world, from drag shows in Ecuador to LGBTQ comic books in Peru.
Wait, seriously? Comic books?
Yeah, it's true. And it sparked a whole new debate about the role of the U.S. government in promoting these kinds of social and cultural initiatives abroad.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, some people see it as a form of cultural imperialism, like we were talking about earlier.
And others see it as just a natural extension of American values, like diversity and inclusion.
Right, and it all circles back to those questions we've been discussing about finding the right balance between promoting our values and respecting the cultural norms of other countries.
It's almost like we zoomed in on one specific agency, USAID, but the issues we're uncovering are much broader than that.
Yeah, it's really about America's role in the world and how we engage with other cultures.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's only going to get more intense as the world becomes more interconnected and the lines between cultures get blurrier.
Wow. It really feels like we've just peeled back another layer of this whole USAID story.
It's like that, yeah. Every layer reveals something new, something unexpected.
Yeah, and it really gets at how tough it can be to promote American values in a world that's so incredibly diverse.
Right. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Definitely not. And what we might see as progressive or even common sense here, it might be totally different somewhere else.
Exactly. Like it could even be offensive or spark a whole bunch of controversy depending on the cultural context.
So how do you even begin to deal with that kind of complexity? Is there even a right answer?
You know, I don't think there are any easy answers, but I do think the most important thing is that we try to have these conversations thoughtfully and respectfully.
Right, and to really acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives.
Yeah, totally. And we have to be aware of our own biases.
Because they can definitely cloud our judgment, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the main things I hope people take away from this whole deep dive. This is not a simple issue.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance here.
There's a lot of gray area, for sure.
We've seen how USAID funding can be used in a lot of different ways. Some good, some maybe not so good.
Right. It can definitely be a force for positive change. But then we've also seen instances where it's been misused or maybe even backfired.
Yeah, and it all kind of boils down to this larger debate about America's role in the world, right?
Exactly. So as we wrap up here, what are some of the key things you hope listeners will remember from our deep dive?
I think the first thing is just how complex this whole issue of foreign aid is.
Right, there's no quick fixes. And there are always going to be some tough choices.
And those trade-offs, they can be really hard to navigate.
Oh, absolutely. But I also think it's super important to remember that foreign aid, when it's done right, it really can make a difference.
It can change people's lives for the better.
Yeah, I mean, when it's used effectively, it can help to fight poverty, improve health outcomes, and make sure kids get the education they deserve.
And it can help us build strong relationships with other countries, too.
Exactly, which ultimately contributes to global stability.
So yeah, even though there's some real concerns about how USAID spends its money, I think it's crucial to remember that foreign aid can have a huge impact.
And I think it's on all of us to keep having these conversations, keep pushing for more transparency and accountability so that we can make sure that aid is always used responsibly.
Yeah, well said. So to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the often controversial world of USAID. It's a complicated issue, that's for sure.
We hope this episode has given you some food for thought and that you'll keep exploring these issues, keep learning, and keep forming your own opinions.
Because at the end of the day, each of us has a role to play in figuring out what America's place in the world should be, how we want to engage with other cultures, how we want to use our resources to make a difference. Those are the big questions.
And they're definitely worth thinking about and talking about.
So until next time, deep divers, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.